Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole Forsgren, and today I'll make things awesome.
Hey, sorry, Nicole, I got locked up, but I was just going to introduce herself because she's awesome. And thank you so much for this, Nicole. We're so happy that you're here, and we're looking forward to your talk. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much. Sorry, everyone. I jumped in because I'm so excited to talk about this. Thank you for joining us. So I will just jump right in like I already did. I am currently the VP of Research and Strategy at GitHub, and I really like Diet Coke. It's kind of what powers a lot of my work. Sometimes I start with coffee, but a lot of people, when they see me around, hopefully someday I get to meet you all at a conference. Someday you'll probably see me walking around with a Diet Coke. A little bit about my background. So I kind of have an interesting work history. And I'm mentioning this because it will help motivate and give a little bit of backstory into why I have some of the ideas that I have around a bunch of this talk. So I started my career as a developer, even before that as a programmer. I started on mainframes, but then as a developer, was a software engineer, started at IBM, and then I was a sysadmin, and then I was even doing hardware performance. And then I kind of took a pivot into academia. I was a professor for a while, and then I came back into industry. When I was in industry, I spent some time as a CEO and co-founder. And then I've also spent a bunch of time advising large enterprises, companies. Now, why I talk about some of this is because it's given me many different insights, viewpoints, eyes into the different types of work that we do and the many different types of ways that we need to talk about the work that we do. Because I noticed that even when we do the exact same work, we have to talk about it different ways. Sometimes I joke that I speak 2.5 languages, English, academic English, and a little bit of Spanish. So I hope that as we kind of talk through some of this, I can help share some insights into how we can increase the impact, or, we talk about broader measures of impact in our work, we can increase some of that. So some of my research and related work, I started doing a bunch of my research into NLP and ML to detect deception. And a bunch of this is because when I had spent a bunch of my time previously as a developer and sysadmin, I was really used to kind of digging and living in a bunch of my logs. I was doing so much work in telemetry analysis to kind of detect and predict so many errors and failures. But I really also needed to understand and be able to talk about sysadmins and their work. So I did a bit of time doing ethnographic work. I spent a bunch of my time in academia talking about knowledge management and collaboration. My focus here was on sysadmins and developers, because when we think about it, we're talking about maintaining and understanding complex systems. We can't do that without talking, sharing information, searching information, knowledge and information discovery. And then the last several years of my work has been spent looking at developer and SRE productivity, as well as software development delivery, which now we call DevOps, using both surveys and telemetry data. So when we think about this, we have lots and lots of data, especially now. But some of our driving questions are, do we really know what it's telling us? A full story here requires the what, the why, and the how. Now, one individual study, especially in research, can't really piece all of this together. But when we tell the story, we need to help kind of pull these pieces together. So we need to understand and account for what our data isn't telling us. And perhaps most importantly, and I would argue most importantly, our data and our results need to be easy to understand, and they need to be actionable. Now, I will say that as a researcher, this is many times some of our biggest struggles, because we want to and we need to include things like challenges, side notes. We want to include nuance. Many people in industry don't appreciate, or they struggle with nuance, right? They don't want all of those side cases. They want it black and white. They need to know what the action is. So how do we think about that? How can we help present a simplified case? How do we help people make clear, easy, concise, fast, actionable decisions in a way that is still true to the data, in a way that is still honest and can help us present our research with integrity? So that's some of what I'll be talking about today, so that we can make our findings and our research impactful, so that we can kind of bridge academia and industry, whether or not we actually want to go back to industry, because I can tell you the grass is not greener on either side. Either way, listen, there are weeds, we got to mow it. Either way, it's kind of a trash fire. So when we think about this, here are some of the tips. So here's what we're going to talk about today. I'll be discussing some data and analysis patterns and business impact that I have seen through 3 of my major projects. So I'll start by talking about the State of DevOps report, so the Dora Project. I'll talk about how I investigated a new field and why I adopted a psychometric approach. Next, I'll extend this through the Dora Project, how I talk about customization and adopting a constraints-based approach. And then I'll chat briefly about some of the work I did in the last year here at GitHub with Octoverse, and how I kind of extended and revised how we were using and doing Octoverse. Then I'll kind of chat about some future stuff, and then we'll dig into Q&A. So first, State of DevOps reports. Some people may know me through this work. State of DevOps report was something that was done, I started late 2013, so 2014 through 2019 was the primary crux of this work. When I started this work, we were partnering with Puppet Labs, so now Puppet, and then we kind of extended this through Dora and Google. We were later acquired by Google, and this is the work that is summarized in the book Accelerate. Much of this work has become industry standard in kind of identifying and understanding what types of capabilities and practices drive software development and delivery excellence and high performance. Here was the problem. When we walked into this work, some of the questions were, what even is DevOps, right? So when we think about this, and this is late 2013, coming into this, people were thinking, well, I've been doing the DevOps, I've been running these things. People have been changing the way they develop software in the industry, and we've been talking about it since 2008, 2009, 2010, but people were still doing heavyweight orchestrated software development, burning people out. Trust me, I felt this pain. 7-day force marches were real. So the questions were, what is this? What's continuous integration? What's version control? Let's talk about the right way to do these. We were fighting over this in conferences, but let's do it after some drinks. And then the large question, particularly in business contexts, when people are pouring millions and tens and hundreds of millions of dollars into this, is, does this even matter? How can we convince people to do this when serious things are at stake? We want answers now, and we probably want answers this decade. Another problem is that system data is very messy, and let's be real, system data lies. And telemetry, if we're frank, is very problematic, especially if we think back to 2012 and 2013. We did not have good telemetry all the way through systems. So how can we even start answering any of these questions in fairly fast ways? So this is what we did. I stepped in, I tossed out what I had been using telemetry data, and said I was going to adopt a psychometric approach. Psychometrics is just a big word for survey data, but not bad survey data, good survey data. How are we going to ask this in very rigorous ways? The reason we did this is kind of a multifaceted approach. It allows us to focus on the capabilities and the practices. What general things are important while ignoring technologies and tools? Because when we think about technologies and tools, first of all, I start vendor fights, right? Second of all, anytime we change versions, we could lose capabilities and practices. Second, we can determine these essential components, right? It becomes evaluative criteria, either for makers, tool makers, if you want to custom roll your own thing, or for buyers. It also gives us guidance for that telemetry that was often missing. Finally, it gives us an ability to very quickly, or at least relatively quickly, collect industry-wide signal. I could collect signal in a matter of weeks, 4 to 6 weeks, that was quick and clean. Now, when I say clean is important because I could roll out a survey, I could identify a question, and I could include the definition in that question. Now, when I say definition, I would not be using an industry term. I would not use a term of art like CI or CD. I would say, how do you do these things in a way that anyone could understand? And I would avoid problems where different teams would use the same term for something different or would use different terms for the same thing. This allowed me to do and collect data very, very quickly. Now, a note here about survey and system data. I know everyone here, I wish I had you all in a room because I could say who here thinks survey data is, and I know you're all going to raise your hand. And I love you for it, it's fine. But who here has seen data in your system data in your telemetry? And I know you're all going to have your hands up. So a quick note here. Telemetry is considered a gold standard, but it's not perfect. Telemetry is noisy, it's incomplete, and the fact that it's precise actually introduces additional challenges for us, right? Because it's so precise, anytime we're off, we're very off, and those offnesses compound, and they compound at scale. When we have well-written survey questions, they can give teams enough signal to allow us to make smart decisions. Again, I mentioned this previously, surveys can be faster data collection. Imagine, if you will, I want to collect survey data around the world. If I have a well-written survey instrument, I can collect that data in 4 to 6 weeks. I can scrub it and analyze it and have it ready in a matter of weeks. In contrast, if I ask everyone for their data, pretend I get this through security and privacy. Is there any way I can collect all of these CSV files, because you all know I'm going to get this in a CSV drop, and have it combined and analyzed in a matter of weeks? That's a pipe dream. Now, in many organizations, there's also a discrepancy between system data and survey data. In some of the most advanced, innovative, high-performing organizations, they are actually collecting today system telemetry data and survey data. I can tell you right now that anytime there's a discrepancy, it's the people who are right. Anytime you ask people what's happening, we need to listen to them. So people lie, systems lie, it's fine. So hopefully you can at least trust me a little bit. If not, take a drink and then pretend, at least for a little bit. So these are some of the example items that we used. So when we think about this, we ask questions about version control. These are the things that loaded. So we were using latent constructs. Now, latent construct is just, the idea is that we can't ask something directly. So we need to ask about the manifest items. There are several items that probably capture a general idea. These are the things that loaded and captured the same idea. So we discovered that version control, the thing that is important and predictive is that we capture several things about version control, not just application code. We need application code, we need system configurations, we need application configurations, and scripts for automating everything. So again, what do we learn here? Remember I said it needs to be actionable. We learned that several things are important, not just code, but the ability to fully recreate systems. By the way, we also learned in later years that database scripts and schemas are important, and people think about them very differently. So when we roll out recommendations for teams, we need to discuss and think about them separately. When we asked about trunk-based development, you may realize this is a hot button issue. Lots of fights are going to break out about this. We tested this several different ways, through different angles, across 2 or 3 different years. We asked how teams do this. What we ended up discovering, so these are some items through one of the years. If teams have 3 or few active branches, if they merge branches to trunk at least once a day, and if they don't have code freezes and don't have integration branches. So what did we learn? What is the actionable bits that we can pull out of this? We learned, by the way, because we asked in separate items, that small batch development is actually seen as a separate practice and capability. where interestingly, some of the prior literature and best practices combined these into trunk-based development, small batch development, where now we realized and we learned that if you want to roll this out as a practice and as a learning opportunity, you do kind of need to separate these because people don't grok them very well together. We also saw in 2 different years that merging to trunk weekly saw noticeably different and statistically significant performance differences, or at least reported differences, much differently than at least once a day. So we did learn that as well. This is our overall research program, which I lovingly call the BFD, the big friendly diagram. You can see it here. Anytime there is an arrow, this is a significant relationship. I've labeled them quickly here, so you can see at least the broad category areas. We see there are several technical practices. There are change management practices. We see lean product management and lean product and lean management. We see there's culture. We see that these things all predict software delivery performance. That's the ability to develop and deliver software with both speed and stability, and that they predict organizational performance. These are things like productivity, profitability, customer satisfaction, efficiency, and effectiveness. We also see things like using the cloud, burnout as well. Many of these practices reduce burnout and reduce rework. I will mention that personally, this is one of the reasons I went into this research at all. I was involved in a lot of probably ill-conceived work when we were talking about why we were doing a bunch of this, and people were just using old methods of software and brute forcing it. And it was resulting in 7-day force marches for years. And there has to be a better way. And there were rumors that this whole DevOps thing could create more sustainable work practices and more money. And it was nice, but like, you can't convince the business to do things just because it's nice for people. And I was like, can I find evidence? Can I win this fight with data? Turns out we can if we have enough evidence. So this is an example of some of the 2018 research, the papers in preparation. Under categories, we can see DevOps pipeline automation. This is a few constructs in here. Process and quality improvements, having a loosely coupled architecture and monitoring observability predicts continuous delivery, and that using continuous delivery predicts an improved culture, improved well-being, and software delivery performance. And then software delivery performance in turn improves performance. So you can see how each year was, just as in academic research, an iterative process. So that previous chart is, I'll admit, a cheat on a good academic process. We have kind of combined all of it. So anyone can kind of take a look and pick out the pieces they want to see. Some select findings when we talk about validating and kind of extending the research. We were able to confirm that technology practices do influence culture. The way we do our work changes the way that we communicate, changes the way we operate. This is a validation from some prior research. Shook, Shine, Spear found this. They found this in places like manufacturing. But the question was, will this be the same in technology? We are working with an invisible inventory. Will it have the same impacts? Will this be real? Yes, this is true. So why does this matter? Why do we care? In the real world, it matters because leaders now have more ways to think about organization, culture change, and technology's role in it. So it did have strong, important impacts. And to this day, when I advise executives at large companies, this is one of the biggest questions they have. How can I think about culture change? What are the things that I can do? Organization change and culture change is important, but we also see that when we change the way people work, we can also change the way they think about work and the way that they communicate with others. So it really is kind of this 1-2 punch that's important. Another thing that we confirmed, DevOps does indeed make work more sustainable. This thing I talked about before. A big motivation for me getting into this work was, how can we help make people's work and their lives better? Waterfall was honestly just lighting people on fire all the time. So can we help make their work better? We have confirmed several years in a row that by making work smaller, in more sustainable pieces and iterative, we can reduce burnout, and we can reduce what we call deploy pain. It's basically that anxiety in the pit of your stomach when you push to prod. Something else that we found that is incredibly actionable is that moving to the cloud improves software delivery performance. Now, this is really interesting because this has also been sort of a hot button topic. Some people took it for granted. Of course, moving to the cloud makes things better. Of course, this is important. But people are like, okay, but what does that mean? And it's super funny because I would talk to developers or sysadmins, and they would say, well, we did this cloud thing and nothing changed. Or I would talk to execs and they're like, well, I wrote this big fat check and nothing changed. Nothing got better. And I'm like, well, that means that you're doing tech the same way we did it in the 80s and the 90s, where you wrote a check, you collected your big fat bonus check, and you walked away. That's not how tech works. That's not what DevOps is, right? The DevOps is tech and process and culture. So we decided to test this, right? Research. So what we realized, though, is that measuring the impact of multi-cloud or hybrid cloud is hard because no one has an agreed upon definition, right? We can't measure something if we can't define it. That's hard. Listen, I walked away from that. That was a hard thing to define. I'm not doing that. But we realized that we can define the cloud. NIST standard 800-145 identifies 5 characteristics: on-demand self-service, broad network access, resource pooling, rapid elasticity, and measured service. So we wrote these into rigorous survey questions that would be easy to understand for our population. And here's what we found. First, listen, I was tricky. First, we asked people if they were in the cloud. Okay, then we waited, had a few more questions, and then we asked them these 5 questions. We found that only 29% of respondents who said they were in the cloud were actually in the cloud. Only 5 of them met all 5 NIST characteristics. So that helps explain when people say they're in the cloud, but they're not seeing the benefits. Yeah, because you're not actually in the cloud. Like, I'm paying for a gym membership, but I'm not going, so I'm not in shape. Like, sorry, like you have to do the work. And then we also found that elite performers, stand by, I'll tell you elite performances in a minute. People who were elite performers were 23 times more likely than low performers to agree or strongly agree with all 5 NIST characteristics. So we do find evidence that if you're actually doing the work, which, by the way, you'll notice here is part tech and part process. Yes, you actually have to do the work. It does help. It does have some good performance implications. So what does this mean when we say that it should be actionable? Companies can focus, now they know what it takes. The other implications, these are architectural outcomes. These have architectural implications. So what this also means is if you're on-prem, even if you're in a mainframe, you can think about how to architect for this and still get many of the benefits of the cloud, even if you're not on a public cloud. So that was also fairly significant. We did have broader implications, which was nice. Okay, I said I would talk about performance. So I keep saying software development delivery. We asked about what are some of the outcomes of development and delivery. For years, there was this rumor that like you couldn't deliver with speed and stability. So we asked. For 6 years in a row, we found that speed and stability move together. They go together. And when you think about it, it actually makes sense. And from a theoretical perspective, it follows economic order quantity. Because when we push only in large batches, when we wait, code batches up. So it's large pieces, which means when you finally hit prod, you have a large blast radius, higher likelihood of failure, harder to debug, longer to restore. When we push in smaller bits, more often, less likelihood of failure, smaller blast radius. When you do have an inevitable failure, because these are large complex systems, it's gonna go down. It's easier to debug. It's easier to isolate. You have a lower impact on customers. They move together. Speed and stability go together. Now, we also see, so we've been using, I use a cluster analysis every year because I want to take a data-driven approach. We used hierarchical clustering because we have a small enough data set to do it. Also, I don't have an a priori reason for why you should have a certain number of groups. What I see is early years, it only really broke into 3 meaningful groups because we know clustering is part art, part science. It starts breaking into 4. And what we see is in 2018, an elite kind of a sub-performance group, because more and more people are adopting these methods. We see high performance growing. In 2019, this performance group breaks out. They're qualitatively similar to the year before. We see elite performance getting better, right? They're kind of breaking out. But again, speed and stability are moving in tandem. There aren't trade-offs. We're able to kind of watch how the industry is growing over time. It's really kind of exciting, honestly. This is an eye chart, but this is what elite performance looks like. We can deploy on demand multiple times per day. These top two are our speed metrics, right? How often can we deploy? Lead time for changes is less than a day. I can push in a change and it can go out at any time. What is my time to restore service? Less than an hour when anything does go down or requires any type of human intervention, right? It doesn't have to be customer impacting. And our change fail rate is low, between 0 and 15%. Now, you will notice here that I am asking people things, but I'm asking them things that they can very easily answer. I'm not looking for a precision type of answer, right? I'm not looking for, is the difference between 1 second and 2 seconds or 2 seconds and 3 seconds. These go up log scale, right? This is anything that someone can answer very, very easily. So I do lose a trade-off, right? At some point, what happens when you get better than elite? You're just not going to be able to answer that, but that's also fine, right? The best, most innovative organizations continue to try to get better, and they do. So one note on psychometrics. So I got a note from the author of Agile 2, Cliff Berg, and he said I could share this. And I really appreciated this note. He said, when I first read Accelerate, I was unconvinced about the usefulness of a capability model because, these things just get misused all the time. But when I read more, I realized how brilliant the book is because it provides criteria for the capabilities. By the way, this is the benefit of using rigorous psychometrics. The criteria strongly resonated with me because so much of Agile and DevOps are not about what you do, but rather how you do it. And again, this is the note about how we help make our research really actionable and useful for end users. We can tell them not only what is important, but how they can do it themselves, right? So think back to that cloud example. I'm not just telling people to go to the cloud. I can tell them the exact 5 things they need to do to make it impactful. Now, when we think about kind of extending this work, for example, software delivery performance, we had these 4 key metrics that consistently cluster together. We broke norms that speed and stability are at odds. They're now known as the Dora 4 or 4 key metrics. There's a quick check online. They can be captured as telemetry, although again, telemetry is kind of tough. So you can also ask an easy question and you can understand and benchmark where you are and where you should be going. We were able to share evaluative criteria. For example, are you doing continuous integration? It was really interesting. A couple times I was working with some top companies in industry and we would say, we would work with them and we would say, oh, continuous integration, CI is your bottleneck. And they would say, what do you mean CI is my bottleneck? And we would say, okay, well, for CI to be working, for you to be doing CI correctly in a way that's predictive of performance, each commit should trigger an automated build, it should trigger an automated test, and it should provide feedback in a few minutes. They would say, oh, well, and it would turn out they had redefined or had differently defined CI. So now everyone has a shared understanding of what CI is, or at least what CI is in a way that is predictive of performance. This can be built into products, pro-serve motions. It can help teams decide. It can help organizations decide on resource allocation decisions. It can be really useful. These key metrics have been built into several tools across industry now, which is really helpful. So again, everyone has this shared understanding, shared-ish, right? People have like kind of redefined like what is deploy, right? Where do you start? Where do you end? But at least we're all speaking the same language now, which is helpful. Now, project 2, the Dora Project. Now, State of DevOps Reports was the research project. Dora was a small company that we started to kind of extend this work. Now, this was based on the fact that many organizations were asking, how are we doing? Which is fine. Like from a research standpoint, this is boring and easy. How do we compare? From a research standpoint, this is boring and easy. You just give them a benchmark. It's interesting behaviorally, though, because we can see how people behave when there's a benchmark or a milestone. And then they were asking, what should I do to get better? This is interesting from a research standpoint, because then the question is, how do we help motivate them? So how do we identify constraints and how do we nudge behavior? What we ended up doing was tricking people into strategy, right? Because they all want a maturity model and they all think that everyone gets the same maturity model, but we know that that's not a thing. So some of the interesting bits here, again, benchmarking. This was the entry in business terms. This was our funnel, right? This was the entry point to our funnel. Everyone wants a benchmark. It's fine. It's boring. It's kind of dumb, right? Everyone wants to. The interesting thing, though, from a behavioral standpoint, some companies really wanted to be elite, so they could just like check the box and be done. Others did not want to be elite. Some leaders were concerned that they would be categorized as elite because they were worried that their teams would just mentally check out and they would no longer feel the urge to get better. That was really kind of interesting from an observational standpoint. Now, this was the gold, though. This was the nugget, was that we also provided, as part of this custom bit of the company, a priority matrix. The algorithm here was adopted from IPMA, which is commonly used in marketing literature, a few other places. You can kind of find it throughout the literature. We made some interesting tweaks, though, based on behavioral observations. And it's kind of some like acceptable kind of like tweaks to the model, because they would do things like make notes. So if you normally look at an IPMA and you're working with researchers who are used to reading models, these things tend to cluster at different corners of the model. But then we would know to say, oh, well, let's look at the one that's in the lowest. But I would hear people say, oh, well, once we get past 50, or we'll just draw a line here and it would be at the 70 line, then we'll be done. And I would sit here and say, oh, well, they're treating this like a maturity model. They're trying to just tweak it and change it around. But the goal here is continuous improvement. Basically, what we're trying to do is force people to always pick what they're the worst at. We want them to force pick and highlight their constraint. And so what we did is ended up rescaling the model so that there was always a worst and always a best. And we ended up removing, this is an old chart that's online, we also ended up removing the axes, so there were no numbers. It would only say high and low and high and low. And then we would work with the organization, or our partners would, God bless our partners, because we did not have the capacity for consulting. They would say, okay, of everything, and we would highlight that bottom right quadrant. For everything that's in the bottom right, these are the things that are your constraints because it has the most impact on software delivery performance, that speed, stability, and it's things that you're currently weakest at, which means it's holding you back. What are you going to pick? These are your most strategic pieces. Work on these for the next 6 to 12 months. They will help you accelerate. The nice thing is that if you're already high performing, it's really, there's no such thing as low-hanging fruit. It's really hard to identify your constraint. If you're low performing and everything is on fire, you don't know how to pick your constraint because everything is on fire. Identifying constraints ended up being the key because it helped you focus, it helped you narrow, and everyone could just leapfrog everyone else. And we saw customers get better really, really fast. So again, when you think about your goal as being actionable and impactful, this was the key. Interestingly, initial hesitancy was really common. Executives are so used to getting 3-year roadmaps. They feel safe, they feel secure, they feel predictable, but you won't see the impact, right? Constraints-based model only gives you short-term guidance, relative short-term. But this is echoed in research. Banking managers who used IPMA to prioritize financial decisions obtained useful insights and are unlikely to be misled. So we aren't alone in this approach. So the key to success here was communication and education. We had to reassure them that this really was the best approach. And like I mentioned before, strong partnerships. Because the challenge here is I'm basically just telling them what's wrong. I'm telling them what's broken and walking away. So I needed to be able to arm them with people who could help implement this. We also had big logos that helped advocate for a research-backed approach. Capital One was one of our very, very first customers and clients. The interesting thing was they were already very advanced in the industry. In just 2 months, though, they showed a 20x improvement in the number of releases with 0 increase in incidents. We had many other public customers that included Verizon, Starbucks, USCIS, NIAD. So we were even across highly regulated industries where many people insist you cannot see fast results. Extending the work. Once we saw constraints were so powerful, we included a public quick check. Many thanks to the Dora team, Jez Humble, Dustin Smith, who made much of this public. So it isn't customized, but we can at least nudge people and make it very, very freely available. Project 3. Now we're getting into telemetry. I'm sure many of you are like, finally. So we did 3 deep dives last year. Now, the thing that's a little different in Octoverse this year, in years past, it was primarily kind of summary descriptive stats. Some of this still is, but it was looking at things like counts and top 10 lists. In year 2020, we wanted to take more of an RQ-based approach. So we did 3 deep dives, one into developer productivity, one into security, and one into community. For this section, I'll just look at the developer productivity section. So the opportunity here was kind of take a look at what happened when we had this natural experiment, right? So we had this dramatic shift from the pandemic. So can we observe this shift in developer data on GitHub? Now, some limitations to note, as I kind of hinted at earlier, we can see what happens in developer activity, but we can't see why. There's a lot of noise and detail at GitHub scale. We've got, at the time, over 56 million developers, and there was no real prior work, right? On GitHub, we hadn't asked these types of questions before, so there was no ground foundation to compare to. And if you want to take a look at these reports, you go to octoverse.github.com and then make sure you kind of look at the download. So here's some of the data that I will be looking at here. The inclusion criteria is to look at paid team or enterprise accounts. And we limited this to anything that was created before October 1. And they had activity each month through September 2020. This gave us a really consistent comparison. So we had more than 35,000 organizations that were included. We focused on 4 time zones. So I'll be talking about UK time zone, US Eastern Standard, Pacific, and then Japan Standard time zone. So some of our questions were, how did people change? Did they work longer and did they work more? So I've noted when the COVID-19 lockdown at least kind of officially happened, that's noted in blue. If you look at the purple bars, this is the difference in push window. So this is the average push window between first and last get pushed to your main branch or main repo. So we can see that this is for UK time zone. You can see that people were kind of chilling compared to the year before, maybe a little lower. And as soon as COVID-19 lockdown hits, people really kind of ramp up their work. So my first question is confirmed. Yes, people start working longer, at least initially, and it kind of ramps up in May. And then my next question is, okay, but are they just working more hours, but they're spreading out their work? So that green line is amount of work, and it's a rough proxy. It's how large is push volume. And so you can see that initially it goes down because people are kind of adjusting, and then it starts going up. And interestingly, as in July, when people kind of even out their work time, that push window picks up. So for some measure of productivity, people get more productive. A very rough measure, right? It really is only activity. So that's UK time zone. Let's start moving west. Oh, sorry, JK. We also wanted to look by day of week because I was super interested here. So when we look by day of week, we see that people are working about 250 minutes more per day. We work less on the weekend, but we continue to work, and then average pushes picks up, although this is due to less developers working on the weekends. Okay, now I skip over New York because New York and Eastern and Pacific are pretty similar, except Pacific, listen, we are not well balanced in Pacific time zone. We have problems. I will note this jump here in November is because Thanksgiving holiday shifted. So we're doing more pushes year over year, and that stays elevated all the way throughout. When COVID-19 lockdown starts to hit, and this kind of shifts because this is largely driven by Puget Sound area and California, Silicon Valley, people start working more and they really step that up. We do start to even out a little bit in maybe early July, but our work volume really stays up kind of throughout, right? So it's sort of interesting. We do see that people are working about 300 minutes more on Mondays. It's about the same on Saturday and Sunday, up to 500 minutes more Tuesday through Friday, right? So we really are picking this up. If we take a look at Japan standard, now here people are working a little longer year over year. When lockdown starts, they are consistently working a little bit more, and then when April and May picks up, they start working even longer. So in Japan, that lockdown started a little bit sooner. When we take a look at push volume, that is higher year over year. It drops a little bit in April. We do see a bit of a pickup in June, and then it kind of evens out. We do see that for average push window, they're about 300 minutes. This is the only time zone that actually drops on the weekends for average pushes. When we look at day of the week across all of the time zones, this is where you really see Pacific time zone standing out. This is not in a good way, and an average push volume as well. I did have a question about work and open source. So we took a look at year over year, average development window. The bars are our development window year over year. Here again, we see Mondays are pretty consistent with Saturday and Sunday. Kids, we got to be taking our weekends off. Tuesdays through Fridays pick up. Now this green line is our open source time. We spend some time during the week and that picks up on the weekends. So this is really interesting because particularly during lockdown, it looks like, we may have finished up work, taken a walk around the block, and come back to open source. I think this is a really interesting pattern because open source can also be an escape for many of us, right? We may have picked up different hobbies, we may have named our sourdough starter, or we may have picked up some open source projects, which I think is really interesting and kind of a great evidence that open source can do different things for us. We also took a look at data around the world. This is one thing that I think is interesting. For here, we look at all GitHub activity. This is kind of a non-finding finding. So if we look at just the general shape of data, this is year over year comparisons. So purple is 2019, green is 2020, that higher line. This growth in activity year over year is consistent with prior years. And we have noted a couple dips that correspond to holidays, but in general, we don't see any major dips that correspond to the pandemic, which is sort of interesting because the fact that there are no dips that correspond to the pandemic show that people are still working overall on GitHub. And I'm like, I'm sorry, what? We are still, there were no significant changes or dips. We also took a look at collaboration and open source. So how are people working? How are we collaborating? If we take a look around, so this is open source PRs. This is how we collaborate. Right around lockdown, people are getting faster. So this time is getting faster, up to 7 hours faster. Maybe because we were all locked at home, who knows? If we take a look at this in team and enterprise cloud, this is the same data set as before. We're getting up to 5.5 hours faster, although it kind of levels off, right? So it's not quite the same pattern, but our turnaround times were faster. Now, as I mentioned before, I can only see what's happening. I don't know why, I don't know what, right? So here we need to turn to other research. So Ford et al. Finds productivity is personal. For most, productivity hadn't changed or improved. However, many feel less productive, right? For those that were less productive, that lack of productivity decreased over time. So it looks like they did adjust, and we see that in some of the charts I just showed you. However, I think something that's really interesting and important to note is that people are affected differently. This really is based on work styles, the challenges they face, the benefits they face. A new paper just released by Microsoft and an investigation they put out on hybrid work finds that high productivity is masking an exhausted workforce. We hinted at this at a very early look, saying that this may be hinting at burnout. Because if you remember, I initially went into this research area because of burnout. People were aghast, like, how dare you hint at this? This is amazing. But we're like, no, this may be looking at some of this. So if we double click into some of Ford et al.'s work, I've included the link down in the corner. This is the good about work from home, because remember, some people this is amazing and some people it's a struggle. So for the people it's amazing, everything in blue has a significant impact on productivity. Everything in green has the strongest impact on productivity. For some people, when they can work from home, they can really control their environment. They can do amazing things. They have more time to complete work. They have better work-life balance. They can control their environment, more comfortable clothing. Listen, yoga pants for days. They have more physical activity. They have better focus time. They have less distractions and interruptions, less commute time. This is wonderful. Now, for others, work from home is like no fun. For here, everything in orange has a significant impact, negative impact on productivity, and those things in red have the strongest negative impact on productivity. It's hard to miss these social interactions and lose awareness of colleagues' work. For some people, working from home actually introduces more distractions and they're lacking motivation. Connectivity problems are real. Losing childcare and having less time to complete work is really difficult, and they're blocked waiting on time from others. So sometimes we just have to ask people. So what do we think about connecting research to industry? By the way, I would suggest you attend industry conferences if you can. I love academic conferences, but so much of my work was permanently shaped by attending industry conferences, asking them what their problems were and asking the words that they use to communicate them. They use different vocabulary than we do. We can also pressure test ideas to see if they're reasonable or feasible, or if they're just stupid. Also consider writing a blog post of your work, 1 or 2 pages equivalent, a brief summary, key takeaways, what this means for me, 3 or 4 bullet points for each. It's super, super helpful, and it helps translate it into what people like. Trust me, no one's going to read an academic paper. They're brutal. Also, partner with industry on projects. So many of my projects when I was in industry were actually partnership with people in the field. We get great ideas. We can answer great projects. And sometimes you can get a branded case study, which can be super fun too. Another thing is consider multiple metrics. So I just released a space framework with a handful of colleagues at MSR. And what we found is that by capturing multiple dimensions, we can better understand a phenomena and provide better decision-making for many people involved. So for this space framework, it's satisfaction and well-being, performance, activity. Listen, we're always using activity, communication and collaboration, and efficiency and flow. So we recommend people use at least 3 dimensions and consider impact on teams and organizations. We include several examples, so I recommend you check it out because some of them are more accessible than you think and more available to us than many even consider. So some takeaways, quick takeaways here. Psychometrics and frameworks can help us investigate complex systems and inform system and telemetry data solutions. Using psychometric approaches can help us understand why approaches aren't working and then communicate or design products and solutions to address these gaps. Large dataset analyses create opportunities to see behavior patterns, which can then help us follow up with these why questions and kind of partner with some of our peers who may have these areas of expertise, or partner with these folks because it can be really fun to kind of get into this these additional qualitative approaches. Amplifying our findings across multiple audiences really allows us to increase our impact and discover emerging areas. I never thought I'd be doing DevOps research, but I'm so, so grateful that I did. And then using metrics from multiple dimensions, whether that means feeling it out like the space framework or augmenting by asking people, or if you typically ask people, adding some telemetry data gives us better signal and improves our outcomes. And I'm sorry I didn't leave time for questions, but I will hang out in the chat if there are any, or you can always ping me on Twitter. I am around. So thanks everyone for your time. I really appreciate it.
So we will move into a breakout room, Nicole, and there are a few questions. And so hopefully everybody will be there in the breakout room as well, and you can answer some of those questions there. But
thanks, everyone.
if you can see the screen, there's a lot of emoji hand